The man who chases 2 rabbits doesn't eat. Anyone heard of that? Hand up if you heard me say that before. Okay, so if you want to eat, what do you have to do? Catch 1 rabbit, right? Chase 1 rabbit, catch that fucker, and then move on to the next. This is the best way of illustrating why we periodize. So this is how I like to define what periodization is by explaining why we should be periodizing. And that is that there are so many different physical qualities that we want to be developing. What are those physical qualities? Can anyone name some? I'll start. Strength. What else? Speed. What else? Power. Hypertrophy. Endurance. Amazing. I'm sure there's more. They're the important ones. The problem is, I want all of those. But when we prioritize all of these equally, we are unable to master any of these single physical qualities because we just don't have the time in the day or the energy to do that. Okay? And over the years, our best scientists and coaches and athletes have figured out the best strategies to essentially chase 1 rabbit, catch that rabbit before they move on to the next. Okay? Split up those physical qualities into their own unique phases, work on that physical quality, saturate it before we move on to the next. Now, this is where there's different styles of periodization, because I will tell you, there is no single style that is the best or worst, and in fact, we can and should use them all together. Okay, so when people say to me, what style of periodization do you use? I'm like, I don't know. I guess block periodization, which is where you separate all of these different phases up into separate blocks. But now let's just give you some simple definitions. Traditional periodization, otherwise known as linear. I use that first because it's probably the best way to illustrate what all styles of periodization typically use, which is, in general, we start our long-term plan with the highest volume and most variation and lowest intensity or lowest weight. Okay? And over the course of the long-term plan, we gradually reduce our volume and gradually reduce our volume and reduce our variation, become more specific and increase our intensity so that we can peak in competition or peak in strength by a certain date or the end of that long-term phase. Linear just tells us that it's done in a straight line. Now, a lot of people don't like the word linear because even linear periodization isn't so linear. It doesn't factor in, deloads or things that aren't exactly in a straight line. Okay, so actually, if you want to sound smarter, use the term traditional. But if you come to me and say linear periodization, I know what you mean. Next, undulating periodization. Now, undulating periodization, let's talk about why we would consider undulating. Does anyone know the pros and cons? Let's talk about the negatives to linear periodization or periodization in general. What's bad about focusing on one physical quality before we move on to the next? What's bad about that? Fuck yeah, absolutely. That's something, we'll talk a little bit about that later, maybe. But that's quite in-depth. What does that mean with the others? The others get neglected and detrained. So this is where we figure out all of these different strategies so that we don't detrain these other physical qualities. Okay, so this is where we get undulating. Okay, so the problem with linear periodization is when we start with high volume and spend that much time away from heavy loads, we're going to detrain our top end strength. And then over the course of the long-term plan, when we eventually get to our heavy loads, we're going to detrain those higher rep ranges and the physical qualities that we gain from those, such as hypertrophy. Does that make sense? So what do we do instead? Undulating periodization. Now there's different styles of undulating periodization. What does undulating mean? Up and down in a wave-like pattern. Yeah, good one. You guys did this. Okay, it comes from the Latin word unda, I think that's pronounced correctly, which means wave. Okay, so instead of traveling in a straight line, we go up and down in a wave-like pattern. Okay, so this is, we have daily, weekly, and monthly. Okay, I've given an example. This is probably my favorite example, and I'll explain why. This is probably how I'd like to train all year round. If I have just in general, want to be big, want to be strong, want to look great. When I mentor a lot of my personal trainers who aren't competitive athletes, this is kind of the style that I like to teach them to do. Okay, where essentially we don't reduce volume in a straight line. Okay, we go from a high volume phase. What are some of the adaptations we can achieve with high volume training? Real simple. Hypertrophy, good one. And work capacity, yeah, good one. Okay, so we go from a hypertrophy phase straight into a strength block. Okay, so we go high reps to low reps. Okay, instead of waiting that whole long-term plan before we get into our strength. So that means we're not spending that much time away from our heavy lifting, which is kind of nice if you like to maintain your strength. And then we go back to high volume again, and then back to strength, and undulate or move up and down from high volume, low volume, high volume, low volume. Okay, what are the negatives to training like this? There's a few. Because nothing's perfect. I'll tell you some. It's not as predictable, so choosing loads, this is something else that I'm going to be teaching you guys tomorrow. Choosing loads, I consider to be the second highest priority when it comes to your long-term success. How do we choose loads? Okay, when it's linearly decreasing in rep ranges, it's very easy to predict how heavy we're going. Does that make sense? So if you're doing 10s of a certain weight, let's just call it 100 kilograms, on the next phase, you're going to do 8s. We can pretty easily calculate, if I do 10s on 100 kilograms, I'll probably go a little bit heavier when I do 8s. Does that make sense? Yet on a monthly undulating periodization, when we go 8 to 12 reps, to drop to 4 to 6, the load selection is not as predictable. This can be a disadvantage unless you're good at knowing how to do this, which I'm going to give you guys the strategies to be able to do this tomorrow. Cool? Cool. Next style of periodization, conjugate. Okay, this is really nice. And actually there's been methods or styles that they consider to be conjugate that's not quite conjugate. The way that the Soviets originally created this style of conjugate. Can anyone call out really loud a very famous style of conjugate? Westside, right, cool. It's not conjugate. Okay, I'll explain why. Well, it is, just not the way that it was originally intended. Okay, the way that it was originally intended was to train multiple physical qualities simultaneously. Okay, but the Soviets understand, if you try and prioritize all physical qualities equally, you're not going to get good at any. So what do? They still prioritize one single physical quality, spend majority of their time and volume over the week on that physical quality. So put a number to that, 80%, doesn't matter if it's 75 or fucking 85 or whatever number you can think of. It's a majority of your time and energy in the gym on one physical quality and the remainder on maintaining other physical qualities. What's harder to do, maintain strength and muscle mass or build strength and muscle mass? It's actually easy to maintain. It's not easy to build, right? So maintaining by just giving a little bit of attention to those physical qualities so it doesn't take away from that main physical quality. Really smart way of training. We agree? Love it? Good one. Sometimes I use it. Sometimes I use linear, sometimes I use undulating, and sometimes I incorporate all of them into the same program. Good one. Next up, this is the Westside method, which is also a great way of training, but this is where I'm going to show you the difference. Louis Simmons from Westside Barbell. This is why I like to teach everyone who I work with to understand the history of training. The amount of people that I work with that have like sporting backgrounds that's not powerlifting. What sport does Louis Simmons play? Powerlifting. What kind of powerlifting? Equipped powerlifting. Okay, so actually, a hand up in the room, anyone who does equipped powerlifting. Hand right up so I can see. Thought not. Yeah, do you know how many people follow this style of training as he recommends it? There's nothing wrong with his style of training. And a lot of you people that shit on his method will say, it doesn't work. Of course it fucking doesn't work. He's training fucking equipped powerlifters and none of you are equipped powerlifters. Why would it work on you? Okay, so context matters. And when you say it doesn't work, objectively, you're telling me, I don't fucking know what it is. Which is fine. Okay, I didn't know what this shit was up until I had to fucking, get a kick up the bum about, 10 years into my career when I started realizing how much shit I actually didn't fucking know. Okay, because I thought that Arnold Schwarzenegger, where's your t-shirt? Stand up. was numero uno. Turn around, please, everybody. Arnold Schwarzenegger's numero uno. Why the fuck do I want to learn second best? No, I want to learn numero uno, right? Wrong, unfortunately. He's still numero uno. But it's important to understand he also doesn't know fucking everything. He's a specialist in his own right, but there are many other reasons why we come and train in the gym. And since his era, people are doing it better than him anyway. Okay? Next up. So this here, the way that Louis Simmons does it is essentially 4 days of training, 2 days of lifting as heavy as possible, that's called max effort, and then 2 days lifting as fast as possible, which is dynamic effort. Okay, I am severely bastardizing this program. There's a lot more that goes into this, but we don't have a huge amount of time. And then block periodization, which I think is kind of what we're doing with all of these different styles. Okay, so block periodization. Has anyone heard of the book called Periodization by Tudor Bompa? Right, like that's the book of periodization, right? And he talks about block periodization and separates his long-term plan into 3 specific phases. The accumulation phase, which is where we start our long-term plan, which is what? What are the characteristics of an accumulation phase? High volume, yeah, I like technique, but technique always, right? High volume, right? Accumulation, it kind of makes sense with the word. Okay, then we have the transmutation phase. So what do we build with high volume training? Muscle and work capacity. Okay, then the transmutation phase, this is where we turn that big muscle and our great work capacity into strong muscle. Okay, and then at the end of that long-term plan, realization, or in other words, peak. This is when we learn how much strength we've actually built over the long-term plan. To put it really simply. Now underneath here, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Underneath here, I've got my 5 phases. Learn to move, build work capacity, hypertrophy, strength, peak.